In this video, I'm going to show you how I string together all of these tools to create my day-to-day AI dev workflow. Want to learn how? Let's dive straight in. The first thing you always want to do is make sure you are using Git and that you start on a clean work state. This is built into VS Code, and so it gets inherited by Windsurf, Cursor, and all of the AI code editors, the VS Code forks out there. And the UI is generally quite well done, so most of the time you don't have to deal with it on the command line. So I'll just show you how I'll be integrating this into every part of my workflow as I go through the review of the code so that you rarely ever have to deal with Git commands. So you can already see that in my history, I've already made about 40-50 commits total over the past couple of weeks. So this is a very efficient process for doing code iteration. In our case, you can see this. I have a very clean repo state with no files committed, and we'll just start off work off there. This is a composer run I've recently just completed. I was adding a new feature to the Visa appointment booking product that I was creating. So this allows the user to create a new configuration that allows them to set the lead time for the appointment booking. And this change involves changes on the front end, involves data saving, involves backend changes, database migrations, and UI tests. So that's why I've chosen it as a relatively well-defined block, but a quite comprehensive change across the codebase. First, it looks for the test and analyzes what's already in there, checks the existing pages for the existing implementation. And here you can see that it uses the command line using the Supabase migration. So Supabase is my current database of choice. And generally my go-to database implementation these days. I'll create a more in-depth video on how I leverage Supabase on a day-to-day basis to have a very reliable local and production workflow. But that's for a future video. At this point, you're probably wondering, how did it really know to use Supabase and also to use these kind of migration in the first place? So I'll walk you through a change that I've recently made to my rules file. The rules file is something that I've already talked about in depth in a previous video, which you can check out just up there. I've been experimenting with this code workflow section to better define how AI agents, so whether Cursor AI agent or Windsurf Cascade or Cline, any of the equivalent, is able to call out to external tools to help it during the code generation. So I explicitly specify when you're creating user-facing features, first search the code base if there's already any end-to-end tests first, and then look to add to it, right? Whenever it's creating a test, always ask user to review the test first before proceeding. Weirdly, I couldn't get Cursor to pause its execution based on this instruction just yet, but Windsurf and Cline seems to do just fine here. Maybe just the issue inside of control flow of Cursor agent. And then once the user confirms the test changes, because I want to use test as a spec for the current changes that's being made, and because reviewing tests makes it quite easy to understand the plan. Essentially, when you ask it to write tests, AI is already writing the spec for itself of, oh, this is the expected behavior for the website, and this is why I should do it. And once it implements a feature, and make sure it runs the TypeScript compiler to make sure there's no type mistakes, because, yeah, there's no point of continuing if there is, right? And finally, once it completes all that, run the Playwright test at the end to make sure everything passes. At the end, I use Prettier to enforce the coding format so that even when AI chooses to use slightly different styles, be it, preferring single quotes somehow, then double quotes in other places, I'll just run the formatter to clean out the whole issue so that I don't have to worry about it. So you can see there's a lot of different tools that can go into this. And additionally, if you look in the database section that I currently have, I also given it explicit instructions on how it should be creating new migration files. Once it creates the migration file, how it should be doing the migrations. Once it's done the migrations, how it continues with the type generation, all using Supabase. So going back to our code generation, you can see with all of that instruction, the thing it ended up doing is it knows to check the test and then create the test in the first place. So when it creates the database migration, runs the migration, and we can check out the migration file first. And we need to enlarge the window slightly. It adds a lead time column that defaults to 7. Great. And even added a comment to the page, right? And because it's aware that this is a Supabase thing, and I've asked it to run the migration, and it will know that to generate the type and do the migration all at the same time. Great. Run that once, all succeeds. And then it will look to actually implement the thing in the file, add all of the content there. Great. You can see that Cursor also creates these checkpoints, and Windsurf, Cline all does the similar things. I rarely use these checkpoints. I always revert to Git to really control the versions and the state of my local repo. Because the thing I often found out is that they have a very prescribed ways of doing these checkpointing. And if you do the occasional multi-switching between different stages, things will start to fail or it just starts to flake out. In general, I prefer to use Git as the core part of my workflow here, just because it's been around for 20 years. It's been battle tested, stick with it, nothing will go wrong. So even in Cursor and Cascade, you have the option to have accept all and, like choose specific changes that you want to accept. I always just accept all and then review the changes directly inside of Git. If we continue with that generation, you can see it generates the code and then updates the test accordingly. And at the end, ask me to actually run the test. So if I close this window, I'll show you the previous test run. Run the Playwright test. All of them executed correctly. So I even did it correctly on the first try, which was quite surprising to me. And most of the time, I have to do at least, like one iteration to solve some minor problems. But it succeeded on the first try, to my surprise. But if we look into the specific test it generated, all of this is written using Playwright. Again, if you want more details on how I've leveraged Playwright to help me write tests, check out the video up there for more detail. I'll continue talking about the rest of the workflow. So inside of the submission page, it knows to check the lead time field, fill in the new number, click on save, refresh the page, and then check that the lead time 14 is still visible. So that's great. And you can see that it's already done all of the validation so that we don't even have to open up UI to do manual validation ourselves. Obviously, when you're looking through the code, you also want to make sure things looks fine for the user. So CSS and styling all looks good. You might still want to do a manual check just to run it through once. But if you just want to check the functionality works correctly, this should be more than sufficient. Here's the other thing with AI generated code. I always review every single line of code that gets committed into Codebase, especially for a project that's already deployed live to users. Because if you just assume AI makes the right decisions, and most of the times people do this without any test, things can easily go wrong, especially with any repo of not even like huge size, even 1,000 or 2,000 lines. It will be difficult for AI to fit all of that context directly into the same window and generate code correctly. Even if it can, having a lot of context also confuses AI more often than not. So you want to make sure that you always check the outcome of the generation to make sure that code looks good and looks maintainable for yourself, because at the end of the day, AI is not the person that's maintaining it, it's yourself. So you need to understand really what's going on. I know this is not yet quite friendly for a lot of the no coders out there. I don't think we've got to a place where products could be easily maintained by no code people, but you can definitely create prototypes very easily for using no code tools, using these AI without having to understand code. But if you want something maintainable, unfortunately, you do have to understand most of the things that's going on here. So if we look in the code, it added some new server actions. That import looks fine. Retrieves additional config. Looks to add in the storage. Great. And on success, it tries to make sure that I removed one of my to-dos. It's spurious, but fine. Because we know this is a spurious change it did, what we can do is we can just click on revert this change. And so this change is moved out of the current working state. Moving on to the next file, we validated this thing works. Click on the plus button, add it to the state changes. Oh, great. Looking at the credentials form, it added the new field, added the schema to validate, min 1 day, max 60. That looks good. I'm happy with those numbers. And so this is time where you can also tweak some of the data. If we look at the rest of the code, it looks to generate, and can we get the side-by-side view? Okay, the window is too small, so it won't let me do that. But we'll just continue reviewing. So looking at the change, it will save the TLS credentials data. It will do so very much explicitly. Great. So once it completes, it just returns fine and then sets the update lead time. That's good. And it adds a form reset. Oh, and make sure it gets the data from the lead days. So this is when it's reading data from the DB. Great. And even updated error because it's now a general settings, not just credentials. I'll probably have to deal with the table renaming at some point, but for now, I'm happy for things to be changing there. So TLX credentials and booking references. Good that they also updated the description. That's very much correct. New form field with validation and even some recommendations, which is reasonable. And so save settings and updates. So let's say if we also wanted some of these changes to be more reliable and repeatable in the future, we could also add in additional rule in our rules file to say, whenever you are making UX changes, update the copy or the descriptions on the website as well to make sure the logic matches the description. This just ensures that AI will always do the right thing in the future. We add this file, look on to the next one, and this one we don't even have to read because I know this thing is actually just generated by Supabase, so that's happily committed, and we'll just add this thing in. And if we look at this spec, which is the end-to-end test, oh, we've already gone through this file. Great. Because we already know that it's already run the Playwright commands throughout the entire test to validate it. So here, I'm just going to be confident enough that you don't even need to check the UI. But in fact, I did behind the scenes. Everything was good. So we move on from here. Now that we have all of the code and reviewed all of the changes and selectively added and picked pieces, now we can generate the commit. And because in my rules file, I already have a section based on the commit message generation requirements. And I just click on the generate commit message thing inside the cursor. VS Code also has the same thing. I hope Windsurf will also add this soon. Super convenient. Even though you can also do it inside of the command line and add a rules file so it does a git commit for you. But just have it in the UI is much more convenient and makes edits so much more easier. And in my case, it will describe the functionality that's being added and add for lead time functionality. Great. It also describes the rest of the change. So this all looks good. And before we do the final commit, I'm just going to check one thing. Looking at the final execution, there's one thing it missed out from the rules file, which is the run prettier command to enforce the formatting. So I'm just going to do that manually to make sure that nothing is missed. npx prettier -- right dot. Okay, it actually created a whole lot more changes than I had expected. After a bit of investigation, it turns out that I had done a previous change to the prettier config, but forgot to run it. So now we've done all of the code changes. We're going to sync it up to GitHub. Before we actually get started, now that we've actually validated the database changes and have run it locally, the next thing that we have to do is pushing the database migration to our production one. Supabase has also made this super easy for pushing the change. Before you do this, one thing you really have to make sure is when you're looking at your database migrations, make sure that it hasn't got any breaking changes. So one thing you can do to help this, in my rules file, I've explicitly mentioned that it should not do any breaking changes unless I tell it to. So this means that be careful with altering table names because you don't want the database to be half broken while you are doing the testing and deployment, right? And so you really want to make sure that it generates a migration that takes into account. So in most cases, it will only try to add in new roles as asked. And at the end, after a few more commits, after you deploy something, after you've done the migration of data from one table to the other, you can do the final renaming in the cloud. So first, we validated the local changes. We can use a simple like Supabase DB push to push our current local config now into the remote database. It will know to track all of the migration that has already happened in the cloud so that it will only run the ones that's really necessary. And in our case, we've added lead time. That's the only migration it will need to run. And it figures that out. And then we continue. Great. After that push, the cloud database has been synced up. For my deployment, I generally prefer to use Replit, especially for early stage projects, because of the easy iteration it actually gives you for like tweaking projects live and doing live testing in the cloud. And also I've synced my configs so that when I run a deployment directly, even the dev deployment inside of Replit, it runs using the production credentials. So essentially, I have Replit as my staging environment, my local being my dev environment. And then we first make sure that it pulls the data from the latest changes I've had. We download, pull, and then you can see run prettier, added the configs. There's a whole bunch of like TLS config, credential saving, and other fixes I've done earlier in the day. Now going through the change, we make sure that we run install to make sure all of the latest packages are all up to date. Then we click on run. If you want a more detailed walkthrough of Replit, check out my Replit video just up there. And then so in our case, we'll see the web page loads up and the visa appointment booking page is this front sub page that I've created. And you can see all of the data there accordingly. The cool thing is if you want to test Replit, once it's deployed, even in the dev environment, this is not a production deployment. You can take this URL that it opens up in the web view and open it in a tab yourself. This thing is accessible by anyone. So you can pass this URL to a colleague to do further verification, or you can use this to send it to a friend or early customers for validations for new features. This is super convenient because in this cloud environment, then you have an environment that has parity with your production, that's also easy to deploy, that's also easy for you to actually make code changes. So in France, we can check out the page loads correctly. I'll also go to my dashboard. Oh, actually, I need to refresh the page. And going to login. Login happens correctly. Put in my credentials. Oh, the login already happened. So we can look at the saved credentials. See? The lead time has been updated correctly. And then so we'll do a change here to make sure that test pass to save the setting. Okay, it's updated. Refresh the page. Check the thing. It's definitely 14. Testing production. Testing staging. All working great. You might see this hydration error, and that occasionally happens because this thing is running inside of Replit that injects some additional dependencies into the page, which causes this error. But locally, when running, you won't have this issue. So don't mind that one too much. Moving back to our page. So that deployment is working fine and you validated it because that's testing in the staging environment. Now you know, even with a prod database, with the prod credentials, things work just fine. Next thing you can do, now go into making the final deployment. And here we'll just click on redeploy as I've already previously deployed a couple of times already. So the good thing with Replit is that it gives you a very clear, simple options to choose whether you want a dedicated machine deployment or whether you want these kind of auto-scaled containers that brings up the deployment as users make requests so that nothing is wasted if you don't have users around. Super convenient to set up. And the other cool thing about Replit is because this is a fully fledged dev environment, so that you can run your npm, so that you can run your next dev directly in the cloud, having that URL directly update, which means if you want to do a quick fix, oh yeah, you messed up a configuration variables here, or you mixed a typo somewhere, you can directly edit in this cloud editor, click on run to test with your product credentials, then click on redeploy again, and then the change goes directly into the cloud. The reason I would have also done a bit more integration directly developing in the Replit environment if I could also run the Supabase local DB emulator directly inside of Replit. But given that they don't give you root permission to run additional Docker images, so you can't do that, which is why I always prefer the local workflow. Because when working with databases, you always want to make sure that you validate your change on a standalone instance before pushing it to prod. Having data breakages is going to be the most annoying thing that you have to deal with. So really watch out for that. So after a bit of wait, the deployment has just finished without any issues. Looks great. And now we can go into the prod site to check everything is loading correctly. And if we go into the dashboard page, and we can see this is on the production website, you can now also set the lead time. And because I ask you to refresh, resave the password every single time, and then click on save settings, wait for the update, boom, 14. That looks great. If I refresh, configuration has persisted. You can really see the power of this workflow where you can push changes, have test, have the confidence that if you ever change anything to do with your configuration, with your frontend, you know that the tests are there to ensure everything is actually working correctly. This is especially important as you are shipping more and more production features, because when you have, 10, 20 features live, you don't have the time to individually test the feature manually every single time. I know we can do that in the prototyping phase because writing tests takes time, but if you have got this AI workflow set up, it can generate the test for you. Then it even deals with the database migrations. So all of this workflow should work very fluidly. It's been now 5 months since I've started using AI code editors like Cursor, but I'm still spending a ton of time trying to figure out what is the right instruction to really give to these AI coding assistant to make it do the right thing. Because you can see that most of these changes, it didn't come from the new AI agents release. It didn't come from new models. It just came from updates inside the rules file to ask it to do different things. I think there's still a lot of room for experimentation and improvement. In the future, I'll be constantly updating this series of videos of my full workflow of taking a feature from initial conception to deployed in production, as I expect my workflow to constantly evolve in the coming year. Comment below to let me know what are the workflows that you also found extremely helpful by putting new things into the rules file. If you're new to the channel, be sure to check out my other AI code editor videos just up there, and I've linked all of the previous deep dives in the description of the video for further reference. Until then, happy shipping, and I'll see you in the next one.